Have you ever wondered what the causes of wealth are in a society? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's segment of The Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of The Libertarian Angle, the show that, as many of you know, brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy and the principles of liberty. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you and to be back with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, welcome back, and come and visit us at fff.org. We've got 30 years worth of articles if you're new to FFF, and subscribe, of course, to our YouTube channel. You know, Richard, I thought we'd raise an issue that both Democrats and Republicans and conservatives and liberals very rarely face. But I think it has meaning in the context of this coronavirus crisis and the lockdowns that both the little Democratic and Republican tyrants have imposed on America that has caused so much widespread economic suffering. I mean, you got businesses that have gone into bankruptcy. You've got people going unemployed. You've got massive numbers of people in the unemployment lines drawing relief from the government. You've got this massive stimulus package that is, supposedly helping people while charging up the national debt. And I think so it raises an interesting question as to what is it that causes wealth in a society? What is it that causes prosperity in a society? We see this massive economic devolution taking place in front of us. I mean, where people are just out of work and their employers are losing gobs of money, and some of them have gone out of business totally. It really raises that fundamental question of what is it that creates wealth, that creates prosperity in a society, and you never see that question being asked, at least not among the statists. You don't. You hear sometimes the question of what is it that causes poverty? What are the causes of poverty? And of course, this was all the context of Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty, and to a certain extent, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal program during the Great Depression. Of that, here we've got to combat poverty. It's like we got to wage war on poverty. Well, the way I look at it is that poverty is sort of the natural state of mankind. People throughout history generally have had nothing. I mean, in the olden days, you had kings that had wealth, but the general population, it was like Hobbes said, life was nasty, brutish, and short for them. Lifespans were very low. People died of starvation and famines, of malnutrition, of illness. And yet, there are societies in which there is higher standards of living and greater wealth, greater prosperity. Why is this? I grew up, for example, in Laredo, Texas, which the Census Bureau said was the poorest city in the United States. This is in the 1950s. And Laredo definitely was poor. I mean, there were people living literally in shacks in some of the ghetto areas of the town that were called barrios. And yet, if you crossed the river, and Laredo was right on the river, the Rio Grande, you crossed the river into Nuevo Laredo, Mexico. I mean, the difference was just marked. You could notice immediately that as bad as things were in Laredo economically, they were like 100 times worse in Nuevo Laredo. Why? Why is it that a great big metropolitan area separated by a river has such a marked difference in terms of standard of living? And the same holds true for societies. There are some societies where there's been greater wealth, and this was posed as an issue in Adam Smith's famous work in 1776, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. What is it that makes certain nations wealthy? Is it that people are more highly educated? Is it because they have natural resources? I mean, like Mexico. Mexico's got massive amounts of oil, and yet it has remained a very impoverished country. Same with Venezuela. You can see Venezuela today is massive oil and yet massive impoverishment. And then you take a city like Hong Kong, especially before the takeover, the Chinese takeover, which is essentially built on a rock. And it this tremendous economic prosperity? Well, the answer was provided by Adam Smith in that famous book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of Wealth of Nations, that the secret to a wealthy society, to higher standards of liberty is higher standards of living, is economic liberty. When people are free to accumulate wealth and to engage in economic enterprise without licensure or permits or regulations or taxation, that this is what is the key, one of the keys to rising standards of living. Why is that? Well, because when people are free to keep everything they earn, they're accumulating wealth, they have savings, they put that savings in banks. Farmers will go in there and borrow those savings to get a new tractor. With the tractor, that increases the productivity of the people on the farm. That increased productivity increases revenues. That revenue is now available to pay the workers higher wages. And so everybody benefits from this process. So that's one key to rising standards of living. And then another one is free trade. That is, in every trade, both sides benefit because you're giving up something you value less for something you value more. So in every single trade, both sides benefit. And it's just an axiom. And so you can increase standards of living in a society just through trade, where people are giving up some things they value less and getting some things they value more. And the corollary of that, of course, is that to the extent that government interferes with this process through tariffs, regulations, controls, trade wars, and so forth, it's interfering with the ability to raise their standard of living. So I think it's important that we focus in on this issue in terms of where we are as a society today in order to build the foundation for a healthy, prosperous, peaceful, harmonious society decades into the future. What do you think?
Well, let me first start off with a question. Now, I know the statistician will tell us that correlation is not causation, but isn't it true that when you left Laredo and moved to Dallas, the standards of living in Laredo started to rise dramatically? I mean, was something going on there? I think a government study needs to be made.
It's very true. No, you've got a good point. Where are you teaching again?
But to build upon what you said, let's just think of the last couple of centuries. Demographers and economic historians, as best as the data from 200 years ago can be put together and collated. The world population in 1820 was approximately 1 billion people. And by rough and ready measures of, what was the quality and the standards of living at that time, it is estimated by such demographers and economic historians that 200 years ago, 1820, about 90% of the world's population lived in abject or really severe poverty. Only a handful of the then population of the world had any limited concerns about where their next meal was going to come from, whether they would have a roof over their head, whether they would be able to have the means to clothe themselves rather than someone dying and their death enabling old rags being passed on to someone else. Now let's fast forward to today, 2020. It's estimated that the world population is somewhere in the neighborhood of 7.7 billion people. That is, almost 8 times as large as 200 years ago. Yet those same economic historians and demographers, and this includes data from the United Nations and the IMF and the World Bank. So these are the mainstream organizations. It isn't just sort of like some conservative historian. They say and estimate that out of that 7.7 billion people today, only about 10% or less live in abject poverty of not knowing where their next meal is coming from. We're living off $1 or $2 a day. Now let's think about that, Jacob. In a mere 200 years, which is just a handful of generations if one thinks about it, in a matter of 200 years, the population has gone from 1 billion to almost 8 billion. And poverty has shrunk where rather than 90% of 1 billion people living in poverty, only 10% of almost 8 billion people live in poverty. when all of human history, as you were pointing out, has been one of, again, Hobbes's phrase, nasty, brutish, and short. Economic historians will often have a diagram or a chart in their articles and books, which is called the hockey stick. It's long, flat, on the horizontal line, and then goes up. Well, that goes up is only the last 200 years, when standards of living were flat, near poverty or below desperate poverty for all of humanity since the beginning of any known human history. What happened beginning around 200 years ago? And what happened was a change in ideas and policies. Now, it didn't happen overnight. These ideas had been stirring, particularly in certain countries in Western Europe, Great Britain, to a lesser extent at that time in France, of the idea that we must think about the institutions of society given human nature. You mentioned Adam Smith. He basically says in his book, men pursue their self-interests. He sometimes uses the phrase self-love. And he doesn't mean self-interest in some narrow sense that, a person only cares about, how much physical stuff he has. That's always been a myth made against economists like Adam Smith. By self-interest, he said each individual has an interest of what matters for him, for himself, his family, his friends, even neighbors, and at one level, even humanity as a whole. But most people just have their own interests in mind. The question is, given that men pursue their interests as they're defining them, how can the pursuit of those interests be harnessed in a way that it may enable them to enrich themselves, but not only does no harm to others, but opens the likelihood of others being enriched at the same time? You said the key to economic reasoning, understood since Adam Smith's time, is that when trade is free and voluntary, it is mutual gain. As Adam Smith says in The Wealth of Nations, if you do this for me, I will do that for you. And that is the essence of every trade. So he basically said, let us imagine an institutional setting in which I can't kill you to get what I want. I cannot plunder you to get what I want. I cannot defraud or misrepresent something to get from you that which I want. And I can't make you my slave, to make you do things to get what I want. Well, if I can't kill you, and I can't rob you, and I can't defraud you, and I can't make you my slave, if you have things that either I cannot do myself, or I can't in any way, shape, or form do as well as you could do it, how do I get you to do those things for me that I desire? And the key of his analysis, Jacob, is this idea that then each individual in his own self-interest must ask himself, in what ways can he apply his talents, his skills, his knowledge, his education, his expertise, his creative capacities, in offering to those others something that they would value more highly and accept in trade for what they have that he wants, and which he would therefore value more highly than what he has to give to get it. And therefore now, self-interest, rather than being in conflict, if I win, you must gain, trade becomes, as the phrase goes, mutually beneficial, or a positive sum gain, in that each one now improves the position of the other as the means by which they improve their own circumstance. Now you take this very simple idea and ask what institutional arrangements are likely to sustain and make it grow. The right of the individual to oversee and manage and control and direct his own life. You cannot force me to give you something. You cannot make me my slave. You do not have the right to kill me. Each is a self-owning master of himself over his mind and his body and its applications. Second, that this means that there is the institution of not just personal self-ownership, but that which one applies one's mental and physical labor to produce. And that means that ownership of property is exclusive and may only be taken from a person with their consent. Now, if there is individual rights of free action, if there is a recognition of private property, and if the only means by which individuals can associate in society, both ethically and legally, is through mutual voluntary consent. Then you set in motion the train of creative juices in each and every member of that society to do things to make their life better, because they can reap the rewards of their efforts, yet in doing so in the marketplace only by enhancing the circumstances of their fellow men. That is the fundamental engine and basis of the prosperity that we've seen. A growing population, because people are now able to earn enough to not have to worry about they and their children starving. But as that population is growing, an enhancement of productivity and the ability to save enough to invest in the tools, the machines, the equipment, the capital, to enhance one's productive ability, both in agriculture and then growing in industry, so that while you have more mouths and hands, those mouths and hands have the creative ability to produce far more than before, so that now 7.7 billion people can sustain in acceptable or even amazing standards of living 90% of their total numbers, compared to only 10% of 1 billion 200 years ago. What is the basis of prosperity? It is the freedom of the individual, the opportunity for him to take advantage of what his creative capacities can lead him to see as possible, and to do it in an arena in which men are free and can mutually benefit each other. Those simple rules, those simple insights, those simple policy and institutional applications is what has slowly but surely, in a mere 200 years, freed man slowly but surely from the abject poverty that we all shared through all of human history. You know, I remember, they still occasionally show them on TV, the images of the starving child in what used to be called the third world. Emaciated, hollow face, empty eyes, flies flying around. Oh, if you just give some small donation per month, you can help this child have. That imagery of that tragic child that is meant to arouse our charitable sentiments, that was the condition of everybody. 90% of everybody, just 200 years ago. The fact that that child is meant to touch our heartstrings is precisely because it's the exception to the rule in terms of humanity today, rather than the rule. When it's the rule, it's the taking for granted. Well, that's the human condition. You just do the best you can and see that you don't starve tomorrow. But when all of us are increasingly prosperous, we see the anomaly of the few who are still in those unfortunate circumstances, and that arises our charitable effort. But it is freedom and free enterprise and the voluntarism of an open society that has made us all increasingly escape from that which was the poverty of each and every one of us a mere 2 centuries ago.
Yeah, because the natural tendency is to think that prosperity comes with time. That is, as people progress year after year, decade after decade, that there's the growing prosperity naturally. Well, if that were the case, there wouldn't be people starving to death in North Korea. There wouldn't be people on the verge of starvation in Venezuela. There's actual institutional reasons why there is a higher standard of living in the United States versus Mexico or versus Venezuela. And this is really the great discovery of the American people. And I think most Americans today do not realize this heritage, this legacy that America has left the world, that America discovered what are the causes of wealth in a society. What are the causes of really, what are the ways to end poverty? America discovered that. And while, you know, Americans in the early 1800s and late 1700s had read Adam Smith's book. I mean, he was a Scottish philosopher, but it was a bestseller over here in the United States, as I understand it. I think it was more that they were more guided by the principles of freedom, as expressed in the Declaration of Independence, for example, that guided them in terms of the institutional structures as to what they wanted America to look like when the nation got founded. So you had this highly unusual way of life that's totally contrary to the way of life we have today. You have no income tax at all, no IRS. I mean, you made it, you kept it. No licensure laws. You want to be a doctor, a pharmacist, a lawyer, a hairdresser, a shoe shine person, a cobbler, or whatever. You didn't have to ask anybody's permission. You just trained and you held out your shingle, and if consumers wanted to patronize your business, they would. If they didn't, you'd go out of business. You'd have to find another job. There was no Federal Reserve. You had sound money. Gold coins and silver coins were the official money. So that provided this financial stability that the world had never seen before, where government isn't plundering and looting people through the inflation tax. You had open immigration where people were free to come in. This is a very unusual way of life here. No drug war. You had no massive federal bureaucracy. I mean, effectively, the only federal official that most people would encounter throughout their lives was the postman. And so this way of life ends up producing this massive increase in the standard of living of the American people, first through the accumulation of capital and to a large extent free trade, especially domestically, because you had no trade restrictions or immigration controls, for that matter, between all the states. You had the biggest free trade and open immigration zone, open border zone domestically between the states in history. Now, we hear people in colleges and universities talking about, the horrors of the Industrial Revolution, that people were, sending their children and their spouses into these factories that would work them, 15 hours a day and so forth. But they really get it all wrong, because they're comparing those conditions to what we have today, when really the right comparison is what came before that. As you point out, when 90% of people are, on the verge of starvation, if you give them a chance at survival and their children at survival by going into a factory and working 15 hours a day, what person's not going to choose that? I mean, the implication's always been that American parents in the 1800s were bad people because they sent their children into these factories. On the contrary, they sent their children in their factories because it was the one way to save their lives and their spouses as well. But over time, if you start out with a society that has nothing, it takes time to develop that capital, that savings through production. But over 2 or 3 generations, man, by the time the late 1800s, early 1900s come along, you've got this massive base of capital now, productive capital. You have this giant free trade zone. You have open immigration from the rest of the world. That's the basis, the foundation for this gigantic impulse toward higher standards of living. And we're still benefiting from that, Richard. Now, of course, that system is abandoned in the 30s, and to a certain extent earlier than that with the adoption of the income tax, the Federal Reserve System. You've got this massive plundering and looting that deprives people of bringing this capital into existence through savings. You've got these trade wars and tariffs. But still, over time to the 20th century, you have more capital and more trade taking place than what the state is able to confiscate. And that's why you still have this upward trend in terms of standards of living, but it boggles the mind. If America had adhered to its heritage of economic liberty, it's impossible to imagine what standards of living would be today for this country. It would just be phenomenal. You can just imagine, going to a doctor and paying $10 effectively in real money for a doctor's visit, or $100 for an important surgery, or $500 for an automobile or something. I mean, it's just impossible to imagine. But that's the situation we face today. Is now you've got the welfare and the warfare state that is confiscating so much money of people's assets that the thing may very well now start cratering in on itself, just like it did in Greece, just like it's doing in Venezuela. The productive capability of the society may not be able to keep up with the confiscatory policies of the government. And that's why it's important that we keep laying this foundation for what our heritage was in terms of economic liberty to get this country back on the right track.
If I can sort of an addendum to that with a twist to it. And that is, we're talking about growth, rising prosperity, material improvements in people's lives. But what is the common response today to those type of arguments? But it's unjust. It's unfair, Jacob. There's inequality. Yes, not everyone is benefiting from it. Well, I know that it is a worn and ridiculed phrase about, a rising tide raises all boats. But the fact is, a rising tide does raise all boats. I mean, I believe that's a lesson of the natural sciences. You fill an empty bathtub with water, and any of the little kids' toys at the bottom of the tub now are rising as the water increases. But separate from that, let's ask what the founding fathers and others of that time meant by freedom and equality. They accepted the fact that human beings were unequal. Not unequal by, some races are superior to others, blah, blah, blah. But they basically said individuals are not the same. We are all stamped with a uniqueness. Partly what we inherit from our ancestors biologically. Are we tall? Are we short? Do we tend towards obesity? Or are we just sort of naturally thin, et cetera, that type of thing? But they also meant determination, will, interest, focus, values, imageries of desires. So that means that each of us are unique as persons. That's why it matters when anyone's life is taken without ethical justification, through a murder, for example. This is a unique person, different from everyone else. And that life has been snuffed out. That should not have been. And in addition, we all are poorer because whatever contributions, qualities, characteristics, benefits that that person by his mere existence and association and trade with us could have given to us, we've lost. But that has meant that the founding fathers meant that while individuals have these inherent inequalities, just as individual human beings, they at the same time says that the only way we can allow each individual to express and live and benefit from his individuality is to have an equality of all before the law. In other words, equality of the law for all, favors and benefits and privileges for none. So that everyone finds their own level based upon their talents, abilities, drives, and what others in the society view their services to be worth. I do not have the income that Bill Gates does. Why? Well, the things that he creatively came up with to market in the United States and around the world is valued by more people cumulatively than what some other members of American society think my teaching and writing skills are worth in terms of the remunerations they're willing to pay me for those services rendered. So Bill Gates earns more money than myself because they value what he can do for them in Adam Smith's trading setting more than they value mine. So it doesn't guarantee. Each one will have the rewards that reflect their drives, ambitions, luck, and the value of their neighbors of the services that they can render. What is an unjustifiable inequality for those older defenders of liberty is anything, way, shape, or form that the state introduces, protections, barriers, inhibitors, regulations, controls, prohibitions that in any way place barriers in the path of some or give unwanted benefits or bounties or subsidies to others at the expense and at the cost of their neighbors. That is unjustifiable inequalities among individuals, because then it isn't based upon a person and his free exchanges with others and each's judgment as to what the services of the others are worth through the open exchanges of the marketplace. It is the hand of power and coercion deciding who shall have more and who shall have less, not in the eyes of their fellow citizens in trade and commerce and association, but through the policing control of the state and saying that we will take from him and give to you, or we will prevent him from trying to compete better than him because we will protect him and give him a privilege that that other person is denied. Now, therefore, there are unjustifiable and socially wrong inequalities, but they have to do with the intervention of the state. As long as there is an equality of rights in an open arena of free exchange and association, then any inequalities, as all standards of living are going up in general and on average as the years go by, is merely a reflection of the valuations of our neighbors and our own characteristics and our attempt to use them.
Well, Richard, earlier in this segment, you alluded to, or you demonstrated your expertise in logic by alluding to the fact that Laredo was soaring in prosperity after I left, and sort of suggesting that there was causation there. And so I would respond by saying that I think there's a very rational reason why Bill Gates makes a lot more money than you do. But I think your point's very well taken. You know, when Americans started this society where you could keep everything you earned, they didn't think in terms of inequalities or equalizing wealth. You know, this whole inequality drive really is based on the sins of coveting and envy, that people just hate it when some people have more. Well, founding Americans overcame those sins and said it doesn't matter. People should be free to accumulate as much wealth as they can get in the marketplace, and then people should be free to do what they want with their own money. And so there was no mandatory charity programs, including Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and education grants and farm subsidies. None of that. And oh, by the way, it turned out to be not only the most prosperous nation in history, but also the most charitable nation in history. When people were free to accumulate wealth, they gave away a lot of that wealth. A premier example of that was John D. Rockefeller, who was the wealthiest man in America, and gave away millions and millions of dollars that built the hospitals and the museums and the churches and so forth. But the point for the poor is this, is that those who want to equalize wealth through government end up doing so by making everybody poor. I mean, like if you go to like the North Korea, everybody's equal there and everybody's got zero. But if you look at a society of, let's say, a John D. Rockefeller that's pulling in, let's say, $100 million a year, and you've got the poorest people in society pulling in $10,000 a year, which is better? A society where everybody's at zero, or a society where the poorest people in society are at 10,000? And so that's what ends up happening. And then when you have the rich that are accumulating these massive amounts of wealth, they're the ones doing the employing. They're the ones opening up the businesses. They're the ones that are providing a market for the good luxury goods today that become the common goods of tomorrow for the masses, you know, like television sets or computers and so forth. It's the rich that are always providing that initial market to buy these things at very exorbitant prices until they finally start being mass produced for everybody else. So if you have a society where you do not let envy and covetousness become the driving force, and where people are free to accumulate unlimited amounts of wealth, and there's sound money and there's open immigration and free trade, that's going to be a society where everybody's benefiting. As you put it, where all the boats are rising in response to this rising tide. And as soon as you start abandoning that and you look to government to start equalizing wealth, then you've got that devolutionary process where society starts to crater in on itself down to the level of where people are in Venezuela, North Korea, and Cuba, where everybody's got zero.
Yeah, the mirage, as Hayek called it, of social justice is basically, and what he meant was that, you know, when you hear the phrase social justice, it seems to be so nice and you know, meaningful and desirable, but it's really a mirage. It's sort of like if you're in the desert, you think you see the silhouette of a city, but it's really an imagining thing. And his idea is that the more you move towards social justice as an implemented policy, you realize it has no substance other than the arbitrary envy and covetedness, as you put it, or the power lusting and plunder of different groups in the political process to get what they have not rightfully earned by using the power of the state to gain it from others. You know, this is idea, you know, caring for others. This you know, compulsory altruism. It's really a code phrase for taking that which does not belong to you and transferring the property of others to yourself, or those who you think rightfully should have it more than the current possessors. That's the dilemma we face. What we need to return to is these founding principles upon which the country was founded. The rights of the individuals, and equality of rights, not privileges and favors before the law, and a constitutional system that is not only existing on paper, but in spirit, that is guided by and serves the protection of those rights and does not violate them. Without that, neither freedom nor prosperity can be sustained or improved.
Well, on that great note, we'll wrap things up. Enjoyed the conversation as always, and thank you all for tuning in, and come and visit us again at fff.org. We've got 30 years of articles and essays and conferences and videos that present these ideas. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. And Richard, I enjoyed the conversation as always, and I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.